I wanted to welcome you all. My name is Akshay Mathur. I'm the director of ORF Mumbai, but I also head the ORF geoeconomics program, which is why you've seen from Samir's email and some of the emails that I am helping the ORF and organize these BRICS events. So you'll see much more of me over the next few months. All I want to do today is I want to reintroduce Ambassador HHS Viswanathan from ORF and Ambassador Mohan Kumar from RIS, Chairperson of RIS. Welcome, sir, to both of you. The participant list in the agenda has been sent to everybody. So all I will do right now is that I will hand it over to Ambassador HHS to start the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshay. Welcome to all of you. Good afternoon to our colleagues in Russia and South Africa. And good evening to our colleagues from China, and good morning to our colleagues from Brazil. Welcome all of you. And first of all, I would like to say that we are extremely grateful that at this short notice, all of you agreed to participate in this very important dialogue that we have planned. So we thank you from the bottom of our heart. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Viswanathan. Earlier, I was an Indian diplomat, and I have been with the Observer Research Foundation for about 10 years now. And in all these 10 years, I have been very intimately connected with all the activities of BRICS. I have participated in every single BTTC, that is a BRICS Think Tank Council meeting, and the BRICS Academic Forum. So BRICS is a subject which I have been following quite sincerely. Now, it's also important to point out that this is the first event that we are planning after our calendar of events was announced on April 14th. That's why the time was a bit short. And the subject that we have chosen, that is the future of multilateralism, did not come about just as a chance, but there was a lot of deliberation. And we wanted to have the first event concentrate on a very, very important topic globally, and that is multilateralism. And all of you will agree that today, multilateralism is an important subject in the global arena. What we have planned is, we have planned it in two parts. The first part I'll chair. The second part, my good friend and colleague, the chairman of RIS, the Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, who are our partners in all the events in these academic activities. Dr. Mohan Kumar will chair the second part. The first part will deal with the general concepts and the larger questions of multilateralism, while the second part would go into the details of some of the multilateral institutions, how well they are performing, what else is to be done to improve them. Now, in each part, one colleague from each country will make an intervention for about 5 minutes. And then in the discussions part, the other colleague can pitch in so that it will make it more lively. And in the other session, they can reverse the order. Now, I have the privilege of chairing the first session. And I won't go into the detail because the organizers have given you the list of questions that we are supposed to address in the first session. There are 4 questions. I'm sure you must have gone through them and applied your mind. All I would like to say is to add a line here that multilateralism has been extremely helpful for the international community in spite of all its drawbacks. Particularly the smaller and weaker countries have found some support in the multilateral system. However, the multilateral system devised after the Second World War has become outdated and is out of touch with the current geopolitical and geoeconomic realities of the world. It's also true that in the last few years, multilateralism has been on the defensive. There has been a decline in multilateral activities, and there is a clamor for reviving multilateralism. Now, my point, and also India feels that in the hurry to revive multilateralism, we should not reinforce all the drawbacks and the deficiencies of the old system. The time has come, many people think, that there is a need for a reformed multilateralism, or shall I call it multilateralism 2.0, where the main pillars will be inclusiveness, representativeness, and effectiveness. Now, with those few words, I will just wait for our experts to give us their views and opinions, which we will be collating and making a report. So I'm sure we are in for very rich discussions. So with that, may I request my dear friend André from Brazil to start the proceedings. André, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Vishwanathan. I have been speaking about this topic on several BRICS events by now, and some of you have also been, for instance, in the Civil BRICS, which took place a couple of weeks ago, which also had a session on multilateralism. So I'll try to have a different take on the subject and not to repeat myself too much, but I ask you to bear with me on this subject, which, as you put it, it is very important, particularly nowadays, where we are fighting a pandemic. We have a health emergency, and we also have an environmental emergency, both of which point to the increasing necessity of providing global public goods. Right? In a globalized world, there is a greater need for the provision of these kinds of goods. And as you know, they cannot be provided without some sort of international cooperation. And international cooperation, in its turn, depends crucially on international institutions. And here we're talking about multilateral institutions because they need to encompass a wide range of members, of countries, so to speak. Now, as you know, the very reason for the creation of the BRICS was multilateralism, and in particular, it was an attempt to reform multilateral institutions in the issue area of finance, most notably the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, those efforts were not entirely successful. The reforms that did come about in these institutions were arguably too little, too late. The IMF, for instance, had agreed to reform in 2010. They were only implemented in 2016, and they fell short of the ambition of the BRICS. And more or less the same thing happened with regard to the World Bank. And I would argue that precisely for this reason, the BRICS have moved on and attempted to create their own institutions of global governance in the area of finance, and particularly the new development bank and the contingency reserve arrangement. So we have a situation that there's a mismatch between institutional power, the Bretton Woods institutions that we had since World War II, and the actual economic power of these countries that have been growing, particularly since the financial crisis of 2008, and particularly China. Now, the issue of multilateralism is not just one of power, as you know, but is also one of legitimacy, and they're both very closely related. Because we have this mismatch between institutional and actual power, there is also a lack of legitimacy in what you're calling the old multilateralism, Chair. And this is a problem, because to the extent that these institutions lack legitimacy, then countries are also less likely to comply with them. And as we have seen, there's a greater tendency for fragmentation of institutions of global governance. We tend to have a plethora of these institutions, and sometimes they overlap, sometimes they even contradict themselves. But a fact of the matter is, because there's so many, they lack efficiency as well. And this is something that the BRICS have to grapple with when thinking about the future of the multilateral system. How to deal with this increasing fragmentation. Right? In theory, it would be easier to reform institutions than to create new ones. But these institutions have proved considerably resilient. And again, those who have power do not give it freely. So an illustration of this is taking place nowadays with the COVID-19 pandemic. Cooperation has failed miserably here. The institutions were not up to the task of responding to the spread of the virus. We have had not only a lack of cooperation, but even of coordination, even of using the same standards for data collection, for instance. Even in that, we failed. And more than that, there has been a competition for resources, for diagnostic kits, for personal protection equipment, for ventilators, and now, crucially, for vaccines. Right? We see the rise of an economic nationalism whereby countries compete. Those who have more to give and more to pay tend to take all the resources. And as of now, about 80% of the vaccines are being given in only 10 countries. And this is a situation that has everything to do with the failure of multilateralism, because again, as a public good, it will not serve the international community in the area of health to only have a few countries vaccinated. There is a need that all reach a minimum threshold of vaccination so that the community as a whole is able to overcome the pandemic. And having said this, let me briefly, within my 5 minutes, I hope, address in particular what the BRICS should look for in a future multilateral system. Well, as you have put it, Vish, there is a need for the system to be inclusive. That has been the tendency of new institutions of global governance. They tend to include not only states, and they tend to not limit themselves to a structure of intergovernmental organizations, but they also include civil society, non-state actors, and they also at least make an attempt to give more voice to marginalized states such as the least developed ones. There is also a very important point that formal representation in these institutions does not necessarily mean influence or capacity to make decisions. So there is a distinction between this formal representation and decisional participation, if you will, and it is necessary, if these institutions are in fact to be inclusive, for them to grant these actors, to grant all the states, including the BRICS and the least developed ones, more decisional participation, and not just be a rich man's club, as so many of them are, and we have so many examples of this. I won't go into them for the sake of time. And so there is a need to ensure both what has been called input legitimacy and output legitimacy, meaning there's a need for the new entrants of the system to have a say in the process of decision making, but also not to be impacted by decisions which they did not make in the first place. And so we should recognize that these new forms of global governance are rapidly replacing the UN model, and they need to be appreciated. But here, there's also a trade-off. To the extent that we have institutions that are more inclusive, they also tend to be less efficient, and we need also to address this trade-off and try to overcome this challenge of reconciling inclusivity with efficiency. We also see increasingly the privatization of
André, sorry to intervene your time.
Okay, can I conclude? Can you just
please conclude.
I will. As I was saying, many of these institutions are made up by private actors, and this is good because private actors, and particularly for-profit companies, they bring expertise and resources to the table. But on the other hand, they also may reduce the influence of developing countries such as ours, and even more so the least developed countries. And in the area of health, the main example here is the Gates Foundation, which is a lot more influential in global health institutions than many of our countries, and because they donate a lot more resources as well. And finally, there's also the need to recognize that global governance nowadays requires a lot of technical knowledge and expertise. So if the BRICS are to be effective as negotiators or as even a coalition in these institutions, they need to invest in technical knowledge and expertise a lot more than they did in the past, and particularly when these institutions, most of them were set up in the post-war period. And I'll stop here. My apologies for going over time. Thanks.
Thank you, André. Sorry. You introduced some new ideas. I'm sure we will discuss it in the discussion session. Now, do we have a Russian colleague? I saw briefly somebody on the screen.
Hello, Vish.
Yeah.
I wasn't supposed to be speaking. This is Victoria. Can you see
Hello,
me?
Victoria. Nice to see you. Welcome.
Yeah. We were supposed to have two people from Russia, but both of them were convened to different very important functions unexpectedly. So I will only, if you allow me, intervene very briefly. And I would be happy to be part of the discussion later on. So when we talk about multilateralism, it is very true of a lot of things that you've been saying and what André has been discussing. One thing I'd like to mention specifically is that when we talk about multilateralism, about the importance of that, on the one hand, it is true we're talking about the need for reform. We understand that there are a lot of things and a lot of institutions, they need to be updated. But on the other hand, what is ever more important with the situation that we saw, that this system that was created and that was institutionalized and managed to avoid any major war, and to, in fact, provide a platform for universal, comprehensive cooperation between different countries, is the fact that we need to strengthen this institution. And what we need to do is we need to primarily counter efforts to destroy it, and counter efforts to offer the set of rules-based of new rules, the so-called rules-based order instead of international law. And we know that international law is, of course, sometimes can be slow in terms of adapting to the new realities, but on the other hand, it tends to be more stable and tends to bring and offer a peaceful platform for further negotiations. And it is much better than force or rules that are introduced by the one or two or a couple strong countries that would like to enforce their vision on the others, on their least developed countries, on the developing countries, as opposed to their inclusive, and you rightly said, you used this word, this is extremely important, inclusive development, inclusive cooperation, inclusive global governance. This is something we need to have in mind when we talk about global governance and multilateralism. And I totally agree with André that in those conditions, BRICS need to stand together as a group. We cannot be acting on our own. Not a single country can be, even the stronger one out of all of us, can be promoting those important issues and qualities and values of multilateralism, of multi-civilizationism, of multiple cultures and diversity that exist on the one world. And also we need extra technical knowledge. I think we need to be leaders, not just in technical knowledge. We as a grouping need to be ready to share the best and the most frontline knowledge that we have in all areas, be it technical, be it technological, digital, anywhere that we are able to make a difference, we need to share with each other, thus ensuring that BRICS can be running at their front line of development and offering the model of cooperation to the other countries and offering them inclusive development. This is another point I'd like to make. And also we need to be, I think BRICS demonstrated it quite well, not in all areas, but in some areas, and on some issues we demonstrated that we are better at solidarity than the world in general, which we saw very well during 2020 pandemic. And this is where we need to continue finding common lines and common grounds, because we would not be able to foster, let's just mention economic multilateralism, right, or economic development, financial institutions that remain the stronghold of their golden billion. And we remember that the last quarter reform was launched in 2010 at Seoul at the decision of the G20 and their great assistance of BRICS as the core group. But now we're having the next quarter reform only postponed several times now till 2024. So we need to be standing together. NDB is a good institution that was introduced, but there's much more that needs to be done with the institutions that are already there and that each of the BRICS countries are using and are members of. So be it UN, be it IMF, be it World Bank, be it WTO, or WHO. So each of them have weak points, but we as a BRICS need to be looking onto common grounds in order to strengthen all those institutions and to offer a new momentum to their global governance and multilateralism as we have it. Thank you so much. That's briefly what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Valeria. You came right in time when you were supposed to speak, you arrived in time. Thank you, Valeria, for your ideas. Now, without much ado, let me go straight to our Indian colleague. I think it is Dr. Ruchita Berry who is going to speak on the first part. Ruchita, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ruchita Berry from the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. And we are gathered together virtually for a dialogue on future of multilateralism, the backdrop of a raging COVID-19 pandemic and the Diamond Jubilee of the United Nations. So in my presentation, I will make 4 points and begin with the relevance of United Nations. The achievements of United Nations are many, and some of them are not measurable. The organization has helped to mitigate dozens of conflicts, saved hundreds of thousands of lives, creating actions, catalyzed decolonization, shaped norms for international development. That said, despite the hopes of its founders and stated goals, the United Nations has disappointed the world on multiple occasions. Genocide in Rwanda is an example. Furthermore, the long pending reforms also question the legitimacy of the institution. Reform had been on the UN agenda right from the very beginning, and the Security Council reforms remains a perennial topic with a plethora of proposals, including expanding the membership and altering the use of the veto. Second point I'd like to talk is what we've been discussing, the crisis of multilateralism, and which is very much faced at present. And I think that this crisis is manifold, from Brexit to the burgeoning populist activism across the globe. A range of issues are threatening the very existence of multilateralism and multilateral institutions. COVID-19 pandemic is the latest in the list, which has pushed the idea and practice of multilateralism into profound dilemma. While in the UN, the crisis manifested in the form of policy challenges and mm, in the other institutions like the Bretton and the World Health Organization, they have faced skepticism of their effectiveness, resulting in the loss of faith in multilateral diplomacy. The third point that I'd like to make is about India's approach towards multilateralism. So some portray that India is as a rule breaker and a naysayer in multilateral forums. The reality is not the same. I feel that India has played a decisive role in many multilateral organizations and in many of the multilateral negotiations, especially in matters such as decolonization, development, counterterrorism, and climate change. India is not only a leading contributor to the UN peacekeeping operations, but many of our soldiers have paid the ultimate price in the line of duty. So, as the elected non-permanent member for the Security Council in the current year, India's approach is new orientation for a reformed multilateral system. And the approach is guided by the tenets, 5 tenets, that is of Samman, which means respect, Samvad, which is dialogue, Sahyog, cooperation, Shanti, that is peace, and Samriddhi, prosperity. This shows India's commitment to multilateralism, rule of law, and a fair and equitable international system. Finally, I would like to talk about BRICS. And in terms of plurilateral groupings, such as BRICS, they are a reaction to the failure of global multilateralism, I feel. And BRICS represent the transformational aspirations in form of reforms of global governance architecture, as well as consolidation of cooperation for development and sustainability. And this is reflected in the creation of new financial mechanism, which has been talked by the other participants also, the new development bank and the contingent reserve arrangement. So as the BRICS celebrates its 15th anniversary, I think the member states should build on the success of the new development bank, invest in other BRICS institutions, possibly in areas such as clean energy, public health, as we are facing a raging health crisis, and digital governance. The group should also consider a sustained BRICS-led effort to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement on climate change and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, member states must reaffirm their commitment to a multipolar world. In this way, BRICS can address the asymmetry of power in global governance and strengthen global multilateralism. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruchita, for putting on the table some of India's ideas on the reformed multilateralism. We'll have time to discuss this in the discussion session. Now, let me go to our Chinese friend. I think it was Dr. Shen Yi, Director and Professor of BRICS Research Center at the Fudan University, China, who was going to speak in the first part. Dr. Shen Yi, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, I'll make very brief introduction of my understanding of this multilateralism in today's world, and especially with the context about the cooperations among the BRICS countries. First, when we use the terms multilateralism, we refer to different contexts in different scenarios. I think in today's world, when we use these terms multilateralism, we refer to 3 things. First, we refer that we should focus more on how to ensure the United Nations could have better environment to function well and to deal with all these global challenges we face today. And the second, when we use these terms multilateralism, we want to use these terms to countering those illegal approach of unilateralism or hegemonic behaviors in today's world, represented by some superpowers in special issues. And the third, when we use these terms, we refer that we want to find out more proper solutions to solve all these global issues in different levels, global levels, regional levels, among few countries. But all these stakeholders can sit down and have equal positions to talk and discuss in the patterns, so all the stakeholders, their rights and interests can be respected and properly concerned. And the second, the main challenges. Generally speaking, according to the theory and the practice, lack of efficiency is the main shortages of the so-called multilateralisms. All people will concern that if we consider too much stakeholders in these decision-making procedures, maybe we will level down the efficiency of the policy-making process, which cannot make a vivid and quick response to the crisis or the challenges we face. And the second, it will be difficult to find a very proper practical models to launch or to deliver the spirit of multilateralisms. We can use these terms and we can organize or write this term down in the chapters. But in the practical levels, we need a lot of initiations or creative initiations to find out proper models for this spirit. And the third is we need to expand the spirit and the practical of multilateralisms in different organizations, especially the newly emerged institutions represented by the BRICS. And the third, among the multilateralisms and the BRICS, I have 3 points. The first, the BRICS countries need to share a common understanding how to understand and deliver multilateralism in today's world. And then we have our BRICS voice on these multilateral issues, either in the G20 framework or in the United Nations framework. And the second, the BRICS countries has a lot of practical programs, and we need to practice our best practice of multilateralism to deal with different scenarios and challenges in the context among corporations between among BRICS member states. And the third, BRICS countries in their own sub-regions should become the kind of, how to say, main points or main harbors to deliver these multilateral ideas to their nearby countries and in their own regions to persuade and to prove to other countries that multilateralism can not only providing a better, is not only have a kind of better spirit and core conceptions, but also can deliver very good practical and to solve our real issues. Okay, that's my point.
Thank you, Dr. Sheni. Now, may I go to our South African colleague? See here?
Yes, colleagues, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah. Dr. Tembu, floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll just have a few points just to add on to what colleagues have made. And I think really it's around really 2 points. The first one is really how the reform efforts of the BRICS countries can be seen as something that has sought to continue the reforms from within institutions of multilateralism, whilst at the same time in also displaying perhaps their frustration at the lack of reforms and in the pace of reforms, is that BRICS countries have seen it as a natural fit to complement their multilateral efforts by actually forming these plurilateral fora and structures. And I think this is a good approach in a sense that you are inside and pushing reforms from the inside, whilst also applying pressure from outside of multilateral institutions. I think whilst also acknowledging that element, I think there's very key lessons that BRICS countries can draw from their own cooperation in terms of shaping
the ongoing reform efforts at multilateral institutions. And I think if we look at these multiple tracks of diplomacy that have become increasingly institutionalized amongst the BRICS, it's something that we need to also then carry out into other structures within multilateral fora. And I think we can draw very valuable lessons there. We can draw lessons about ensuring that cooperation is not only at a state-to-state level, but that it is also amongst track 2 and track 3 actors. The second point draws from the efforts that have been undertaken by BRICS countries over the years and how they fit into BRICS efforts at solidifying, making more resilient multilateral institutions. I think if one thing has been missing, at least a strong component that has been missing within the various multilateral efforts, is that they've not been sufficiently complemented by a strong regional infrastructure that links individual nation states and their regions with the existing multilateral fora. And I think this is where BRICS countries, drawing from the model of the outreach programs, with each summit essentially seeking to attract also and involve members from the region. I think this is something that's quite important in moving forward. So I think it's those two elements really. It's about the reform efforts from within and from without institutions of multilateralism. But at the second point, it is really about strengthening that regional layer of multilateralism so that the agreed to international goals that we all share also play a much stronger role within our various regions, and each of our countries become important actors for greater regional cooperation, but also for greater international cooperation. And then I just think lastly, it's about also ensuring that whilst BRICS countries are pushing for reforms, they do not necessarily only get stuck with, let's say at the UN, only get stuck with discussions around the Security Council, but it's also about how to strengthen the General Assembly, how to strengthen the specific organs of the United Nations development system, so that they are stronger at an international, but also at a regional level. Let me leave it there, colleagues.
Thank you, Philani, for that intervention. Now, I must thank all the participants for not taking too much time, which means that I have about 10 minutes for discussions on the ideas that came up in the first part. So anybody who wants, he can raise his hand or send me a message on the chat box. Just to show your hand and I'll give you the floor. You can make a brief intervention. I see Akshay wants to say something. Go ahead, Akshay.
Thank you, Ambassador HHS. I have a question and a comment. My question is to our Chinese colleague, Dr. Chenier. He was trying to make a point about, I don't know, Dr. Chenier, I don't know if I picked up all the words, but you said something to the effect of that we need to restrict or restrain the effect of the unilateral influence of current hegemonic powers on multilaterals. I picked it up, but I don't know if I understood it completely. So if you can just explain what you meant there, and if you have an example where you're seeing that happening, that'll be interesting. Thank you. So that's my question. But my comment is to André. I mean, is related to something that André was saying on the influence of private organizations and multinationals. Actually, André, you didn't say multinationals. I don't know if you said, but I missed it. private multinationals have a very big influence on multilateral work also. In fact, I remember doing some research work last year that I don't know if this statistic still holds, but at that time that the entire budget of the United Nations, not the operational budget, which runs on contribution by member states, is actually less than the budget of New York City. Everything else has moved into trust funds, or it has moved into dedicated issue-specific funds. And if you move into trust funds or issue-specific funds, obviously it's going to be dedicated to certain kinds of work that the United Nations is that particular fund is directed to do. It could be saving, it could be assisting Palestine, it could be related to Ebola or something in Africa. But if it's specific to a theme, then they're doing very well as a fund, but the overall work of the United Nations gets impacted. So there's definitely a question about funding, and there's a question of private organizations like Gates Foundation, etc., influencing. And then there is multinationals. In fact, I think it was under Kofi Annan's time that they brought in a lot of companies to work with the United Nations. Even today, we have the United Nations Global Compact, etc. And it's a really tough challenge, because you want the business and the private sector to be included, and they have the resources, they have the supply chains to deliver on so many SDGs. At the same time, you want to restrict their influence on policy, and that's a challenge, I think. And I don't think we have answers, but I think as think tanks, we should come up with some recommendations there. And there is also one more area, other than the private organizations and private multinationals, it's also private standard setting organizations. So, when we get into the technical field, most of the standards on technical issues, digital issues today, it's all being set by private consortiums, and it's the entire ISI network, in this case, on how they give the seal of approval and on, is a whole study area. So I think there is definitely a lot of influence on the multilaterals, and I don't think we found a good way of making sure we can leverage the resources but somehow restrain the influence they have on policy. So that was my comment.
Thank you, Akshay. Before I hand over the floor to Dr. Sheni to clarify the question you raised, is there anybody who wants to make a very, very brief point? I don't. Yes, André, please go ahead. And
I'd just like to respond, if I may.
Please.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Akshay, for your comments. I completely agree with you. I believe the term I used was for-profit companies, but sure, most of them are multinationals, and you're completely right. They do exert a significant influence in decision making in these institutions of global governance. Perhaps the most telling example is the TRIPS agreement, which is now being discussed again in the context of the need to expand the production of vaccines, and the proposal by India and South Africa in the ambit of the WTO to suspend intellectual property rights for vaccines and other products needed to fight COVID-19. But the TRIPS agreement has been almost entirely the product of the influence of the multinationals, right? And particularly of the pharmaceutical sector, but also others. And there are other examples. These companies, they do exert a significant influence, even when they don't have a seat at the table, as was the case with TRIPS, because companies do not have representation in the WTO, but they manage to lobby their governments. And nowadays, we see that not only they have the resources and they exert influence by donating, but they also have a seat at the table in most of these institutions. And in the health area, the Gavi, the Global Fund, the International Council for Harmonization, speaking of the setting of standards and norms, as you put it, these are all organizations that have private actors with decisional powers on them, and in agriculture as well. You have Global Gap, or GAP, even the Codex Alimentarius. So again, I think yes, this is a very significant development, And it brings challenges as well as opportunities to have the private sector playing a larger role. I think they need to be regulated clearly so that they don't take over the process. But again, we may not afford to keep them out. Thanks.
Thank you, André. Dr. Sheni, would you like to clarify to Akshay Mathur the question, the query he raised?
Yes, I think that it means we use the term multilateralism. We need to give it a very clear definitions. When we use these terms, multilateralism, we mean that more than two or more countries, a lot of countries, they join together and then they sit down together with the respect to the equality of their sovereignties. So they have a relatively equal positions in this decision-making process to bring out the policies or strategies to dealing with the questions they all face or to deal with the challenges. So it's a kind of different decision-making procedures comparing to so-called hegemonic structures in which very few countries or even single superpowers can make the decisions and can accord and according to their own understandings to the international laws. So that's I mean that when we use these terms, multilateralism, we're talking about that we should use, we would prefer such kind of either principles or patterns to carry out or to deliver the policies to deal with our problems, comparing to the hegemonic procedures or orders. Okay.
Thank you. I see no other hand. So, yeah, Ruchita, briefly, if you have to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to this whole discussion on multilateralism. I just wanted to say that it is equally important that that the countries today, especially the countries which are not so privileged, like India, Brazil, and others, who are aiming to be at the high table, they should focus also in terms of working towards shaping the discourse on a particular issue. And there it is important to develop a coalition within these institutions, whether it is the UN or the others. So that is the big challenge. How do you develop a coalition on a particular issue which you think?
We can't hear you. We have lost you.
Mute.
Please unmute.
Yes.
Yeah. So what is important is that we develop on a particular issue and work towards developing the discourse in a particular multilateral institution. That is what I'm looking for. Yeah.
Thank you, Ruchita. So with that, I think we come to the end of part 2. All of you will agree that it was a very rich discussion, also a very nuanced discussion with very interesting ideas coming in the presentations. I thank all the participants, and discussions can continue in the second part.